So thank you all for being here. We have a couple extra guests, and I appreciate that. This is our second presentation of the day, and obviously on biodiversity. The one thing I would say before we turn it over to the students is that this program, which has been going on for about 8 years, honestly couldn't happen without the assistance of our providers, Katie, Jessica. It really is important to get people to step up and give their time, and we really appreciate that. We know how busy everyone is, but it means a lot, and I think that you're going to be very happy and surprised to hear what we hear about California's, or at least Los Angeles, biodiversity, or perhaps lack thereof, we'll see. So with no further ado, just to give you a sense, the students will present for about 40-45 minutes, and then we have the remaining time for Q&A. We're going to make it a little more informal and allow the students to sit around the table so we can actually have a round table of an open conversation so that we can get all that valuable information to you all. So with no further ado, our biodiversity group.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. I'm Molly.
I'm Helen.
I'm Maiah. Lindsay.
Monica.
Archanaa. And today we're going to be talking about Los Angeles urban biodiversity and giving some recommendations on what the city of LA can do to better preserve it. First, we want to start off by thanking all of our partners and providers here. We couldn't have done this presentation without you guys, so we hope you enjoy. So to start off, we're going to give our definition of biodiversity because there are quite a few definitions out there within the scientific community, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're defining biodiversity as the variety and variability of life. This can be measured through species richness, which is the number of species per unit area. And you can quantify biodiversity using biodiversity indices, which measure how many different species there are in a specific area, while also taking into account their distribution over time. So to give a little context within the Los Angeles area, LA is about 469 square miles, and it has one of the highest population densities of all major US cities, as well as also considered one of the global biodiversity hotspots, with over 1,200 native LA species, as well as over 150 sensitive species and plant communities. So this makes it extremely important to be preserving this biodiversity. So one way we looked at quantifying the biodiversity within LA is through the Singapore Index. And the Singapore Index was created at COP9 in 2008 by the Singapore National Parks Board. And before this index, the biodiversity indices were more scaled for a national or international level, so there was no way for individual cities to really quantify their own biodiversity. So this original index, as you can see on this left right here, has 23 indicators, and those indicators measure the native biodiversity, ecosystem services, and governance and management of biodiversity. And the overall goal of this index was to create a self-assessment tool for cities to monitor biodiversity conservation efforts and to track their progress over time. So basically it's giving cities the ability to create their own baseline and then be able to track their progress comparing to when they first took the data. So as you can see here, this is what the Singapore Index would look like if LA was ranked, and while this chart here shows it's only out of 72 because some of these data points were taken baseline this year, so they weren't included in the full index. So like I said, each subsection is ranked out of 4 with a total of 92 points. So some of the issues we ran into when thinking about using the Singapore Index for a biodiversity indice is that Singapore is only 17% of the total land area of LA, as well as has different ecosystems and habitats and policies in place. So it would be difficult to kind of use that in terms of a Los Angeles scale, which would be much larger. So there would definitely need to be some sort of adaptation if the office was supposed to use this index. So something interesting that some UCLA students did in 2016 was that they created an adaptation of the Singapore Index specifically for the Los Angeles area. So while keeping in mind the original indicators, they rearranged them into different categories, such as vegetation, fragmentation, freshwater ecosystems, birds, insects, and reptiles. And within each of these different categories, they looked at biodiversity differently. So when they were looking at freshwater ecosystems, they measured biodiversity in terms of all the different watersheds in LA. Or when they were looking at the birds, they went around to the different habitats like woodlands, coastal marshes, and things like that. And so something else interesting that the UCLA adaptation includes is the involvement of community participation and community science. So with this, they got over 41,000 usable data points, which was extremely helpful, especially when establishing some of these baseline indicators for the city of Los Angeles. So when creating a biodiversity policy, using this community science aspect would be really helpful. And while on this topic, while this does have a better adaptation of the Singapore Index, there are still some things that I think the adaptation doesn't include that the City of LA should include in their biodiversity policy, and that would be incorporating marine species and coastal pollution when quantifying the biodiversity, as well as giving more consideration to species at the bottom of the food chain, like phytoplankton and algal species. Those can really determine and set the kind of biodiversity that's available in different areas. And lastly, they don't really give any sort of thought to endangered species. While they do mention native and non-native species, managing endangered species would be much different than the prior two. So now I'm going to turn it over to Helen, who's going to talk more about other cities' policies and how Los Angeles could incorporate them.
So in looking at other cities to model Los Angeles policy after, I had to keep in mind comparability and scalability factors. So this includes population size and also climate. So looking at Mediterranean subtropical climates. So my lead was San Francisco, just because I know they're trailblazers in regards to policy as a whole. And rather than having like research-based initiatives and citizen science programs, they have like actual tangible policy that I could look at. So they have an overarching, first of all, they have a warm summer Mediterranean climate, which goes along well with Los Angeles. And they have an overarching biodiversity program with 5 main goals. And these goals all are a very holistic view of environmental stewardship and biodiversity, and they're very intersectional and also keep in mind environmental justice. So I want to point out 3 main parts that I thought would be great to implement in Los Angeles. So first, the urban forest plan. So San Francisco has the smallest tree canopy size of any major U.S. city at 13.7%, and Los Angeles is higher at 21%. But I do think we could model their aggressive approach to implementing or planting more trees in the city. So first, this program identifies the tree species that maximize the most ecosystem benefits. Then they will add 50,000 urban trees by 2035. And they establish a tree maintenance program, which transfers the maintenance of trees from private to publicly maintained. And then the Street Parks program is a program that increases biodiversity and enhances habitats with small parks throughout the city that are managed by neighborhood communities, so it brings people together and also enhances biodiversity. And then lastly, the Green Connections plan. So the main goal is to connect citizens' access to nature through a network of green connections, and there are 3 main deliverables with this program. So first, there's the San Francisco Plant Finder, which citizens can look up plants in their area that enhance biodiversity, and they can take matters in their own hand and plant in their backyards to increase biodiversity. And then there's the Green Connections Network and Ecology Guide on the top right, which is a network of 24 routes around the city where citizens can go along these routes, bike paths and everything, and it has specific information on the local flora and fauna, and they can find out more and how they can take action to increase biodiversity. And then lastly, the deliverable is a neighborhood concept designs. So it encourages environmental justice through conceptual designs for 6 focus neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods have a high population density and large minority populations. So it provides information on how to increase biodiversity and urban green spaces in underprivileged communities, which I think is really important. Okay, next I looked at Madrid, Spain. So the population is in 2016 was estimated to be 2.3 million, which is the closest of all the cities that I looked at to Los Angeles. They have a warm, temperate, subtropical climate, which goes along well with Los Angeles. So in 2016, they have their natural plans for climate change adaptation and mitigation. And through this, there's a lot of small projects that they've implemented. So like the wooden birdhouses, and because of the increased usage of construction through with concrete and glass and less brick, there's less spaces for birds to nest in bricks. So they put around a bunch of birdhouses. So in 2017, they installed 100, and then in 2018, they installed about 160 more. And while this scalability in Los Angeles is pretty difficult just to put a bunch of birdhouses around the city, I think it would be really important to focus it on urban neighborhoods where there's like increased skyscrapers, especially in downtown LA, where we could put around birdhouses. And then the urban agriculturists who quantify biodiversity in Madrid, they point out that the plants we normally call weeds are actually the biggest source of biodiversity in urban spaces that we can find. So from this, the city lets grass grow taller in their parks. It does not remove primary vegetation like urban weeds, and it limits the usage of pesticides, so that creates a healthy insect population. And then in 2015, Spain updated its green infrastructure and biodiversity plan, and this requires biodiversity programs on municipal, national, and regional levels, and for all autonomous communities to create their own green infrastructure strategies. So from this, Madrid created the Ecological Corridor Network. So this is very similar to San Francisco, where they have a metropolitan green ring where they connect all existing urban and metropolitan parks together through a green corridor. And I think within Los Angeles, this would be pretty difficult to achieve because it's a sprawling city, lots of neighborhoods, but I think if you can scale it down and put it in like urban neighborhoods where it's like could really enhance biodiversity, and then just from starting small and get it to be all Los Angeles could be connected through green spaces. And then lastly, another city I looked at was Lisbon, Portugal. So again, they have a hot, dry, subtropical climate, and which goes along with Los Angeles. So they have the National Ecological Reserve Act. So this is a hierarchical system of territorial management that operates at the national, regional, and municipal level, and it incorporates both green and blue infrastructures. So the municipality of Lisbon established the Lisbon strategy for 2010 to 2024, and in this they have 3 key goals, but the 2 main ones that go along with our project is climate change adaptation, which they want to increase urban green spaces, and then connectivity of green spaces, which goes along with the main theme of urban green corridor networks, and it implements a network of green spaces, corridors that encourage recreational activities, but also promotes biodiversity at the same time. And then Lisbon Biodiversity 2020, it includes a detailed description of the city's ecosystem of biodiversity, and it outlines specific objectives and indicators of biodiversity because they have a plan by 2020 to increase the city's biodiversity by 20%. And then again, like other cities I mentioned, they have the main green corridor in Lisbon. It's 2.3 kilometers long, and it mitigates the urban heat island effect that we'll talk about later by connecting 2 main parks through the city center, and through with bicycle lanes, bicycle-friendly streets, and just gardens around the city. And then, just as a summary of my presentation, in my research, I found a lot of projects and initiatives, but no tangible goals that we can achieve. And I think a big part of seeing results of biodiversity being enhanced are numerical goals. And I think it's really important that we maintain stringent goals and numbers to achieve. And then just a theme that I saw was green corridor networks and urban green spaces. And I think they're both really important to enhance the city's biodiversity. So next, Maiah is going to talk about parks planning development programs.
So I'll start with urban parks planning, and then I'll also give 2 examples of possible infrastructure that we can incorporate in the city after the biodiversity strategy has become more cement. So the first part of parks development is deciding how and where we're actually going to develop. And there are accepted practices in conservation biology that are known to maximize the effectiveness of conservation areas. So some of those include larger is better than smaller, intact is better than fragmented, clumped is better than linear, and we also should be including wildlife corridors whenever possible. And transportation links for humans, such as footpaths and cycleways, are known to reduce the amount of disturbance to natural areas. So if we're including those in the way that we're developing parks to begin with, that already is a great pre-planning measure to undertake in order to maximize not only the green space that we have, but also to just enhance preservation overall. As far as planting vegetation in parks go, right now Los Angeles County is a national leader in the planting of synthetic turf. And that's for reasons related to maintenance, durability, and water usage. However, natural grasses are known to stimulate biological life in soil, such as insects, worms, and fungi. So if we're either using natural grasses or possibly one of the 71 grasses that are native to Los Angeles, we can stimulate that biological life. And native grasses also obviously address the water usage aspect. As far as layering goes, this would mean planting smaller shrubs nearer to the ground, larger plants and trees further back, and this just better mimics the natural structure of vegetation. So this not only allows for a healthier environment for biodiversity to grow and prosper in, but it also will provide a wider variety of habitats for a wider variety of organisms. And as far as mowing goes, Lindsay and I noted when we were doing field work in some of the parks in the urban areas that the partners had given us a list of, they were very heavily mowed. And although that can be important for mitigating insects that might be carrying human vectors, it is known that mowing can have a negative effect on insect populations, especially pollinators such as bees. So if we're limiting mowing in all parks in general, that is going to increase our biodiversity. And then kind of going off of that, moving into pest management, in 2017, the ban of anticoagulant rodenticides was expired. And the way that it was working before was that within any park that the Department of Recreation and Parks has control over, the use of second generation anticoagulant rodenticides was banned because they're known to have a negative effect on the physiology of wildlife, especially small mammals. So we should definitely look into renewing that resolution or possibly creating one similar to it in the future. And as far as tree infestation and disease goes, as Helen noted, urban forestry is going to be an integral part of any future biodiversity plan. And the city of Santa Monica has implemented certain practices such as sterilizing tools in between pruning and also not working on days where it's windy to reduce the transmission of fungal disease spores, to reduce the overall amount of infestation and disease that's occurring within trees, to again not only allow for a more healthy habitat, but also to prevent the amount of biodiversity loss in trees that's happening to begin with. And lastly, urban forestry in general, the species listing of protected heritage and special value habitat trees should be expanded because right now the list is very limited. Moving into stormwater retention ponds, it's kind of been accepted that stormwater retention ponds can act as biodiversity islands in a lot of situations. And this study in particular was run in 2005 by Sure in Theory, and they kind of just evaluated the correlation between urban biodiversity and the existence of stormwater retention ponds, especially for dragonflies and amphibians, and found that stormwater retention ponds within those areas, not only is there a higher amount of biodiversity in general, but they also have the potential to act as refuges and corridors for endangered species. And so my hope in including either stormwater retention ponds in future parks development or just including them in our surveys using iNaturalist and whatnot, is to possibly increase the biodiversity of organisms that have historically inhabited the Los Angeles River, such as the blue darner and the Baja tree frog. And I know that at our mid-semester meeting, we discussed again the issue of mosquitoes and other pests. And a pre-planning measure that can be undertaken is planting natural repellents such as marigolds, geraniums, and lavender. And also just supporting the biodiversity of predators such as the bird population that's already in existence here. Just because I'm a little apprehensive about endorsing any chemical insecticides because most mosquito insecticides are known to have a negative effect on aquatic life. So obviously that would end up reducing biodiversity. And lastly, I'll talk about bird-safe buildings. As Helen already mentioned, San Francisco is a trailblazer in environmental policy. And in 2011, they implemented bird-safe building standards for the entire city that are really just focused on limiting bird collisions to limit overall mortality, and also limiting the amount of light that's in urban areas because that can be disrupting to navigation and also overall disorienting. And the two types of treatments that they look into buildings are frosted and angled glass, which basically just signal to birds that there's a physical barrier there, as opposed to reflecting the outside environment and having them feel like they can literally fly through the window to get to the other side, or if they think that there's an immediate perch, food, or anything like that, they know that they need to fly around. And the netting and external screens basically are just a pre-collision, so even though the birds are impacted with the netting and screen, it's a lot less fatal than what the collision with the actual building would be. And some of the lighting treatments that were discussed were just avoiding uplighting and light spillage to limit the overall amount of area that's being lit up. And you can see over there next to Lindsay what some of those examples would be like. And green and blue light is also preferred because it's less disrupting than wavelengths of white and red. And now Lindsay will talk about valuing biodiversity and some of the environmental injustices that come along with that increase in value of green spaces.
Yeah, so I just do want to note before we get into it that the actual act of valuing biodiversity is a little bit controversial. This is because a lot of environmental communities believe that biodiversity should just have an inherent value in and of itself outside of whatever instrumental values humans assign onto it. But valuing biodiversity in monetary or qualitative terms can really help to inform stakeholders, to help motivate sustainable investments, and to justify some of the policy that Helen and Maiah were just talking about. So when talking about the methodology of valuing biodiversity, there are two different ways overall to do it. So that's talking about it at the genetic/species level, and then also talking about it at the ecosystem level. So alpha diversity is really just species richness, and this is just the number of individuals in a given area, just like Molly had mentioned. Then there's also the Shannon Index of Valuing Biodiversity, which looks at the abundance of species in an area. And this is really used for identifying high natural or human disturbances to an area. And then there's the Simpson Index, which looks at the relative abundance of species proportional to the total population in that area. And then looking at the ecosystem level of biodiversity, there is beta diversity, which looks at changes of biodiversity within or between ecosystems. There's gamma diversity, which is a function of alpha and beta diversity, and this looks at the total biodiversity in an entire region. And then I really want to highlight this idea of functional diversity because this says that there's that the capacity of a life support region to handle shock or stress to that area requires a minimum level of biodiversity. And I thought this was really important, especially when looking at areas like LA, where there's just increasing urban environment. So moving on, I'd like to further divide the idea of valuing biodiversity into quantitative and qualitative methods. So quantitative valuation of biodiversity requires a reductionist approach value. So this really just looks at the aggregate of all values that we can assign to biodiversity, the use and non-use values of it. And this really just reflects our human interactions with biodiversity. And I want to talk a little bit about the idea of assigning a market value to biodiversity, and these here are some of the given methods that we can do it with. So the revealed preference method really just explores existing market data that we already have, like the travel costs of going to a green space to check out some cool biodiversity or the production function of that area. There's stated preference methods, which is using things like questionnaires to just ask people what their willingness to pay is for these different species. And then there's, so that was stated preference. And then there's bioprospecting, which is really just the willingness to pay for chemical compounds within a given species. And if you think about it through the lens of like the pharmaceutical industry, this would be really relevant. It's a little bit less applicable to Los Angeles, but I still think it's important to mention. And then there's biodiversity as a function of species preservation. And this is really just the willingness to pay for society to avoid the loss of that given species. And then this last one I really want to highlight is biodiversity as a function of natural habitat preservation. And this really links the value of biodiversity to the value of that habitat protection based on things like tourism, recreational demand for that area, the health benefits of having that natural area. And this really bleeds into the concept of creating a market for biodiversity. There was a ton of really conflicting research that was out there on this concept, but of course an effective market for biodiversity would both be effective in conserving biodiversity, but also economically efficient. And this really bleeds into the concept of green spaces, which we have mentioned before, and what the qualitative value of biodiversity should be. So before really discussing green spaces, I have another disclaimer. So we just need to really talk about the environmental justice issue of green space accessibility and availability. Green space is just simply not equally accessible and available to people of all demographics. And that's really unfortunate because there are tons of health and social benefits to living in close proximity to a green space. So some of these health and social benefits include improved mental health, reduced cardiovascular mortality and morbidity, improved pregnancy outcomes, which I thought was pretty cool. There was reduced obesity rates, and these all resulted from improved air quality, enhanced physical activity of the people living around there, social cohesion, and a mitigated urban heat island effect, like we all talked about earlier, and enhanced immune system from being exposed to microbes, which is really especially relevant for children being exposed to microbes at an early age. And all of these health and social benefits can work to reduce health inequalities that exist between different demographic groups by addressing the upstream determinants of health to reduce population-wide inequalities through some of these things. And this graph right here, it's kind of difficult to see, but this just shows that the closer proximity that you are to a green space is really kind of determined by your ethnicity, your race, your income level, and obviously we really want to change that trend. But we can't really do that because there's this green space paradox that we have to talk about. And this states that basically the greater the size, number, quality of urban green spaces in any given area in transition, the more attractive and desirable that area becomes. And that favors the displacement of people living in that area to less desirable and consequentially less green areas. And this is supported by tons of studies, but I wanted to make special note of the Harlem and Barcelona studies that I found. And this just shows that as green spaces proliferated in Harlem, New York, and in Barcelona, Spain, over the 90s and early 2000s, there were trends with regard to property value increasing and demographic flux as a consequence. So if we want to introduce green spaces as a method of improving biodiversity in an urban setting, we just have to recognize that this is an issue and put in certain policies to protect this problem. So one example would be residential and commercial rent control, so as to protect the people living in that area so that they can also benefit from all the great things that urban green spaces with biodiversity can bring. So now Monica will talk a little bit specifically about how to integrate biodiversity in LA and talk a little bit about some of these ideas that we've mentioned. Oh yeah, sorry.
So I'm going to be talking about how we can integrate biodiversity into other sectors here in LA and kind of pre-existing infrastructure that already is here in LA. So first I'm going to be talking about LA sanitation and some of the biodiversity assessment it currently does. So Molly and I had the chance to talk with Regina Wetzer at the Natural History Museum, who specializes in marine biodiversity. And from this conversation, we were able to understand that it's really hard to get a comprehensive list of the biodiversity in certain areas, but there's already certain transects going on for LA sanitation wastewater impacts. So from this, we were able to see that we could maybe take this another step and implement it into other sectors such as construction and development to get a preliminary baseline of the biodiversity in this area and to further determine which processes were harmful to biodiversity and which ones promoted biodiversity by first preliminary getting this data. Along with this, I also looked into Caltrans transplant, which gives you information on which plants are allowed to be in medians on highways. And I looked into this because, as Helen and Maiah were both mentioning earlier, connectivity is a huge thing in increasing biodiversity. And so if we can look into which plants and which interns of fauna that are associated with this certain flora, we can help better the biodiversity. So there's already a comprehensive list of which plants are allotted in each section. And so if we take further practices that Maiah was explaining, such as layering and selective mowing, this could be a great way to increase biodiversity and connectivity throughout the city. Along with this, other states have taken this as a point of interest, as seen as with the Monarch Highway, in which a few states formed a coalition to use better practices to support pollinators and fauna and flora within these corridors. And so then they would bring in increased traffic to see the monarch butterflies that were along these highways. So some of these practices were like decreased mowing, select pesticide and herbicide use. A really big part was educating adjacent landowners so that they can help also support this effort. Also, I know LA currently is really invested in their sustainability plans, so I was trying to look into how it could be integrated into both supporting like the lower carbon emission and lower heat island effect. And so of course we came up with more increased green space, and I was looking specifically into urban forestry and constructed wetlands. So in regards to urban forestry, it's like innately, if you have an increase in tree canopy, you're gonna have an increase in both the flora and the fauna associated with it because it brings increased habitat. Along with this, it's a great way to decrease heat island effect because it limits the amount of concrete that is present in these areas. And along with this, I was able to look at a few studies by Travis Longcore, a professor here at USC in spatial sciences, and he did a research project informing that tree canopy has actually been going down in the most recent years. A big part of it was a result of people doing housing expansions in order to integrate pools and like other unnecessary parts of their houses. And I thought a great way to remediate this is to help further incentivize green spaces within them, including like trees. So better advertising programs such as like city plants that we already currently have established. And along with this, I also thought integrating increased urban forestry into like certain green business certifications to incentivize other businesses to include this into their greening plans. Along with this, I also looked into constructed wetlands. So I was looking specifically at the South LA wetland, just like a mile away from here. And also Travis Longcore did a study on the assessment of this wetland, and he was able to show that the presence of this wetland not only increased the biodiversity of the surrounding area, but it also decreased the localized heat island effect by up to 7 degrees. So people were coming specifically to this wetland to see the nature, and it was bleeding into adjacent parks that were there. So I thought that would be another great way if the green space is available, but I know constructed wetlands take a lot more than just that space. Along with this, I was also looking into how other cities integrated biodiversity into their plans and kind of like what they valued from biodiversity. So in London, a lot of their programs were focused on coordinating a bunch of small external programs and an emphasis on urban planning. So I'm not going to go over urban planning again because I know Maiah already covered this. But this coordination in smaller external programs that we already have in the city, like I was mentioning, city plants, incorporating the natural history museums, iNaturalist program into like a larger set city program. Like just recently, last week, I went over to the library downtown, and they had programming surrounding science and STEM, specifically around plants and that. And if we could just start integrating biodiversity into like smaller programs such as that, to like actually plant the seed into like further programs. And then I also looked into Mexico City, and a lot of their evaluation was done in regards to biodiversity in sanitation and wastewater treatment. That's how a lot of lower income communities got a lot of their wastewater treated, in addition to what they already have set. And also they valued safety with biodiversity. In a study done by Unruh in 2016, it was a surveying study, surveying residents of Mexico City, and it showed that residents associated better security with increased rates of biodiversity. But this has been like heavily scrutinized. Well, it's not scrutinized, but it's been debated by contradicting studies, both here in the U.S. and in like other places. Along with this, I also saw that LAPD had a program that they were starting with in regards to environmental design, in which they were looking into architectural design and how it regards to safety. And in this, they were looking into how certain plants and nature features affected safety, and if we can take native plants, pollinating plants, and implement it into these sort of programs, that would be a great way to like increase biodiversity in just a small way. Lastly, I was looking at Sao Paulo, which focused on environmental protection, green corridors, and community health and biodiversity. So they were really focused on community health and bringing a connection between health and biodiversity, as Lindsay was speaking about. And I found a great study by the University of Georgia looking into how bird biodiversity, increased bird biodiversity was associated with lower rates of West Nile virus, which is something that's like really prevalent here. And if certain studies like that could be done in the LA area to bring this connection, that could really show the valuation of biodiversity. Yeah, so that's my stuff. But Archanaa is now going to speak on a case study in regards to invasive species and further policies.
All right, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about effective governance practices of biodiversity issues, and I'll be doing that through the case study of invasive species management. So why invasive species? Economically, it's a $100 billion cost annually to the US. It also affects over half of all federal threatened or endangered species. Finally, there's also a study by Carrie Wilson done that looks at priority setting in the area of biodiversity conservation, specifically in Mediterranean climates such as California, and they found that investing towards specific threats, namely invasive species control, has the most cost-effective outcomes. And specifically in Southern California, it's significant now more than ever because the shot-hole borer, two beetle species native to East Asia, puts over 26 million trees in Southern California at risk, and the potential cost of replacing all of them would be $36 billion. It's also widely acknowledged that invasive species is the second largest factor of biodiversity loss behind habitat destruction. So principles of this case study is really important to broader scale biodiversity management. So currently, looking through the governance, there's a pattern that you can see. In the federal level, the National Invasive Species Council was created through executive order in 1999 for coordination between agencies and experts. There were 8 different agencies working on it prior to that. Similarly, at the state level, the Invasive Species Council of California was created as an interagency council with members of 6 state agencies because there was piecemeal actions occurring by different agencies and there needed to be coordination between them, so that is currently the highest authority of regulation on invasive species. Locally, there's much room for improvement. One thing that I found was the LA Weed Management Area, which is an organization that brings together landowners and experts to coordinate efforts, but solely against invasive weeds. And also the LA County Agricultural Commissioner is currently the main agency for regulating pests and non-native plants. So there's obviously a lack of concerted effort and coordination at the local level. So I have 2 main recommendations. The first one is creating a multi-stakeholder local council on invasive species. There's a framework by Gardner in 2016 that emphasized non-native species aren't inherently bad. And so there are different perceptions from stakeholders on their benefits, so coming to a solution requires coordination by all of them. So examples of models that we can use for that are the Invasive Spartina project in San Francisco. So that's actually a state-sponsored project by the California Coastal Commission. And here's a graph of each So there are a lot of stakeholders that they use, private contractors, even the local government, the city of Alameda, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service federal agency. And it was very successful. 95% of the invasive species was eradicated, and also the ISCC, like I talked about before. So opportunities of stakeholders that we could use locally are universities, NGOs, obviously local agencies, but also state and federal agencies, and importantly, getting representatives from industries, so economic stakeholders. My second recommendation is tied to climate change policy. So studies have shown that climate change and
invasive species obviously have compounding effects. Both of them will affect the other. That was a 2008 article by Pike that discussed that, and tying the two will also alleviate the problems that come with both issues using conflicting methods, and that's very just inefficient. So linking the two for the public is also helpful for improving awareness of both topics, especially in LA. I know Garcetti is really focused on climate change. So working with the LA Mayor's Office and Sustainability Plan, if possible, would be really helpful. But also just integrating it into local agencies' actions, like sanitation or whatever is working on biodiversity. A good example of this is Chicago. So this was taken right from their website. It's a promotional brochure for invasive species. And they clearly talk about the link between the two and even include the website to learn more about their climate action plan. And I think Chicago is a really good model because in 2007 they passed an ordinance that bans certain invasive species on their regulated list. And I know that's something that the LA Biodiversity Plan also said that we should consider in LA. So that's mine. I also want to mention before I read through these that there's no silver bullet to solving these issues. So there are a lot of small suggestions that all of these people talked about that are really important, but we want to condense it into between 6 to 8 big ones. So I'll just read them off really quick. Use the UCLA adaptation of the Singapore Index as a framework for the future biodiversity policy. Implement a voluntary light stock program during migratory season and incentivize participation with already existing complementary energy efficiency subsidies to reduce bird mortality. Require live grass planting in all LA parks developed after 2022. Build more urban green spaces in conjunction with rent control policies to combat gentrification. Integrate biodiversity assessment and valuation into other LA sectors. Establish a centralized local council with all relevant stakeholders. Create strong link to climate change policy, and create a green corridor network in diverse neighborhoods to connect parks and urban green spaces. So we want to thank all our partners and everyone who came on again today for making sure that this presentation could happen, and we're ready to take questions now.
Very good, very good. So why don't we have the students come down and join us? And as I mentioned, I think our plan is to have an informal conversation for our remaining 20-25 minutes and continue our discussion in details. We always defer to our partners, so whoever would like to fire away, please do.
You guys did awesome. Across the board, that was really good. You all know the material really well. You'll be pleased to see in the plan coming out that a lot of these things that you've come to are kind of reflected in what's policy. So I don't really have subject matter questions, but I want to ask you some questions that are about implementation and challenging, just to kind of see what you think you might do. So with the letting grass go higher and mowing and maintenance, one question in the research is, did you find anything that shows that there have been public health challenges that resulted from it? So there's more trash collecting in those areas, it's harder to maintain. And then how would you kind of resolve those? All of these things have kind of the counterpiece. So how would you think about management, where when you're doing this and this great biodiversity, you might be challenging it in other ways? How would you kind of resolve that, thinking about implementation? There's not a right answer.
I can take a stab at this one. I think the big thing that Maiah and I just really noticed was not only was it mowed, but it was bare minimum, just really sad, worse than USC.
Start here.
So really just, so I think the recommendation, of course, isn't to, have a wild looking, almost threatening to public health, because I understand that concern, especially when it comes to trash and maintenance issues. But I think we just want to see just a little bit better. I don't know what that happy medium would look like. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, Maiah,
I agree, because again, we don't want a forest of all this crazy foliage. But I just feel in general, doing it less often. You know what I mean? Because she said, there was literally nothing.
It was just sad.
Flat.
I remember some discussion in one of our meetings where there have been some parks that you researched or studied that sort of designated areas as, I don't know, more wild, not the right word, but less manicured, for lack of a better word. is there any thought that maybe parks might just designate areas? It's not a perfect answer, but at least one could put up postings and stuff so that they understood that it was a thoughtful strategy and not just, well, I guess whoever was doing maintenance didn't do their job well.
Yeah, and also I think something we just, in addition to the mowing, we just also noticed a lot of concrete where maybe there could have been grass or dirt pathways instead. So it wasn't just the mowing that was bad, but there was also just, the green spaces weren't even all that green. And so I don't even know if the mowing was the worst part, to be completely honest. I think the concrete was what was really bad.
Yeah, there was a very, that first park that we went to, it has a highway going through it. And so one half, there's no water and it's mostly concrete.
First challenge.
And then you walk through like this little, I don't know, there's like a little, I think like bridge over or something, because we went through like a tunnel to go to the other side where there was a body of water, and like even having that water there was a significant difference in the urban heat island effect. And I just feel like that proves, at least in terms of like linking it to climate change, like that proves that there's like that correlation there, I guess. And we also saw like around the lake there was like these weird cinder blocks with dirt in them but nothing planted. And so that's another easy way to just, I mean, you can literally just plant something in there. And like, there you go, like you're increasing biodiversity. That's another habitat for another species.
You reminded me that you guys did field work. How did it go? That was great answers also.
I think just the field work, we didn't really find as many maybe species on the list as we had hoped. Yeah, we mostly, I think it was most of the biodiversity we did see ended up being birds. Because there's so much concrete and like so many people, I just feel like the biodiversity didn't really have a chance to be there without being sat on or like scared away.
Stepped on,
yeah. So that's kind of what we found. I know we went in 2 separate rounds, so at least for the round I went on, we found maybe like 5 birds that were close enough to photograph.
And a turtle.
And a turtle. We found a turtle.
That's pretty good.
How did you choose where you went? Like, how did you know where to go within the city? Are these areas already prioritized for biodiversity studies, or were they, you looked at a map and you decided?
So we were given a list of different areas of parks, and we decided to choose areas in kind of Koreatown area. Yeah, but there are a bunch of other parks too, but I think these are the kind of parks that the city was mostly focusing on in terms of biodiversity efforts.
Were most of these parks old? In other words, I'm thinking, were they like sort of 1960s, 70s structures where maybe people may or may not have been as concerned with, flora and fauna, and they're just like, okay, let's put concrete. And so LA's just hasn't caught up to making changes because it's like, well, the concrete still looks good. Was that your sense that these were sort of parks that have been around for a while, or were any of them more recent?
No, we didn't look up the age of when these parks were established, but I could buy that.
Well, I just wonder if that's part of the inherent problem is that, some of these, the mentality from a certain decade might be, well, this is what our view of a park is. We're going to have a perfectly manicured piece of grass, and we'll have 4 trees, and and of course, over time, people start to understand the value of sort of more biodiversity and more green space. But once a park's built, you're talking about dollars to go break up that concrete and replant and re-landscape or whatever.
I have what I think is a stupid question because I am not an environmental studies person, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. So I was thinking about like planned communities like Irvine, because you kept talking about green spaces, and I guess what I was wondering is, you go into Irvine and it's super green, there's trees everywhere, and that's not a climate. They've brought in a lot of plants that are not native to that area. So I guess I was wondering what, and if you even know, what that does to the existing biodiversity. If we were going to enhance green spaces, but then bringing in plants that aren't native to it. I don't know if that's a stupid question.
Do you want to talk about the invasive species?
Yeah, I mean, so non-native doesn't necessarily mean they're invasive, so
Okay.
that would be, I guess, like a case-by-case basis on whether they're becoming like pests or actually affecting the environment, but that is something that should be looked at, I guess, when you bring it in. That's also what I was saying about multi-stakeholder stuff. There's some that like are hurting biodiversity, but from an economic standpoint, some stakeholders will want to keep it, you know.
Got it.
So
Okay.
yeah, so it depends on.
One of the main benefits of using native species is that it's going to be promoting those other native species that use those plants as habitat or food or things like that. So that's kind of just the main benefit. It's not necessarily that non-native is bad, it's just that bringing native species is going to enhance more of the other natives that are going to be there.
Yeah, and I think native is always better, obviously, but you know, I was talking about like tree infestation and disease, and I know that the Recreation and Parks Department really are not super into planting native oak trees, for example, because those are the trees that are having the beetle infestations. Mm-hmm. So even though those should be prioritized in terms of like the fact that they are native, it's just not always doable or like the best option.
Is it typically a consideration though? I mean, when they are starting to figure out, okay, we got Park A and we're going to do something, is that a priority?
They prioritize native and drought tolerant.
The other thing I was wondering was, you just talked a lot about environmental justice, and that's not a term I've realized when you were saying it that I've heard since I've moved to Los Angeles. I used to live in San Francisco, and everyone's constantly talking about that. Is there a reason why that's the case? You guys kept bringing it up, and I was thinking about how that was kind of ingrained in San Franciscan culture.
I mean, we talk about EJ all the time.
Yeah, I would assume, yeah.
And it's really big for environmental studies students in particular, I think, but you're right. I rarely hear it spoken around casually on campus. Mm-hmm. I'm in a sorority and I mention EJ and people are like, who? Yeah, it's really interesting now, cultural shift as you move southward through California, that it just seems to stop being a priority.
I think here in LA, a lot of the EJ that I've ever heard of has been only in minority groups and only socially active people within them, because I'm part of an EJ organization in Southeast LA. And the only LA groups that I've really heard of are the ones that are north of downtown LA, and then the ones that are south of downtown LA. So I feel like if you're within
magically the ones that are affected by environmental justice.
Yeah. And they've been being more heard at the table in certain efforts, bills SB 535. They've had really prominent efforts within it. But other than that, I didn't really hear about it unless I went around and spoke around. Oh.
Yeah. But it's something we hear all the time.
Yeah.
And are really focused on in our planning efforts. Because
it
is, and you all pointed out that we want green areas, but we also have to figure out how to not displace communities, and it's something that is really a challenging thing to figure out how we do this. How do we bring value and make sure that people that live there can stay and benefit from it? So it's something I think that in LA you'll start.
And I think a lot with the LA River remediation projects, it's been really prevalent there because of all of the gentrification that happened in Chinatown and all of those sort of areas that have had the projects where they've been beautified, but then with that, gentrification has moved into the area.
Mm-hmm. So with the example that you were showing in the South LA wetlands, was there any efforts around sort of protecting that community?
I'm not quite sure for that community right now. I know in addition to that, they also added a lot of new fast food areas. My dad works down the street from me, so that's kind of why I'm familiar with it. But yeah, they've added a lot more shopping malls, so I'm assuming that it'll probably get more and more gentrified, but I'm not quite sure because it's really surrounded by a lot of disadvantage. I think it's usually easiest for the areas that are already on the border of higher income neighborhoods to see that transition happen easily. But for the South LA wetlands, it's kind of already kind of encompassed by low income communities, so it'll be more of a slow encroachment, I think, than building out of it. Yeah.
Other questions?
I had a general question for you guys. When you were talking about biodiversity and invasive species, I keep thinking about naturalized and introduced species that have been here for a long time and sort of where they fall in that spectrum of priority or prevention. And did you think about those kind of species? Things that have been here for 50 years and kind of become part of Los Angeles but aren't native? because I don't know, I always wonder, actually, I was gonna ask Katie, but I decided to ask you first, how you deal with those, because, you know, the environment's constantly changing and things that were well suited here aren't as well suited anymore, and other species are coming in and settling for the long haul, and it's a complicated thing to deal with.
What if you even think about like, what's the most iconic thing in LA? Palm trees.
Yeah.
Those cannot be native.
They're
There's
because
no
of the
way.
Olympics. They're because of the 19
Yeah,
whenever.
I figured they were from some big event.
That was
right?
like the thing that they wanted LA to look like, but they're from.
It looks like it
Italy,
now,
so-
and you tear up roads and everything else.
Do you guys have a?
I mean, in terms of like invasive species, I guess like it's not an easy thing to like eradicate any species in general. So I think most of those species that are like introduced and have been established are not gonna be like eradicated or tried to be removed unless it's like becoming a pest or something that really needs to be.
It'd be more effort to try and like rip all the palm trees out of LA
Yeah, exactly.
than just kind of keeping them here.
Yeah. So like, again, I don't think like non-native is like the priority for like getting rid of something. It's only if it becomes invasive.
So one of the things I heard from students last year who were working in the LA tree office is all the things that the city has to deal with liabilities related to trees. Did you guys get into any of that at all? Things like roots causing sidewalks to buckle, or storms, trees blow down and land on a car. I had never thought of that before, and I was like, wow, that is a big issue.
Yeah. I feel like if we're going to try to look at it from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, that would totally have to come into the cost, right? But I mean, I personally, like when I was doing the market value research stuff, I didn't really find a ton of that, but I also wasn't really focusing on trees specifically. And now I wish that I had, because that's really interesting.
Like, I mean, the infestation that was mentioned.
Yeah, and I know that in the city of Santa Monica, it's a lot harder to get a permit there to remove a tree than it is in Los Angeles. And I can't tell you the entire process because obviously it's very intensive. But that came up like in some of their guidelines, like when you feel like you want to cut a tree because it's in some way like inhibiting human life, basically because of the roots or because it might fall down or like whatever it is. They require that like their city arborist goes to that site and like basically confirms that it's actually like a real, I guess, risk before anyone can actually remove it. So I think that could possibly be translated to the policies here. But I also know that it's really hard to, if I learned anything from this class, it's that it's really hard to like explain to constituents like the science of things sometimes and like why biodiversity matters. And so I'm not sure if people are going to be super open to not being worried about those tree roots or like about that tree like falling on their home. So that's also something we'd have to consider.
Yeah, and in San Francisco, in their program, they transfer the trees to be maintained by the city and not privately, even if it was like on a private street or something. So I think that would help. Less like territorial.
Would you say that's one of the bigger barriers to lack of biodiversity thriving in Los Angeles is the fact that people don't think about it, people don't go around looking at grass and bugs and birds for the most part. And if that's the case, I'm not suggesting it is, but if that's the case, how can it become more prioritized? What strategy might be undertaken?
Well, the one that I talked about was tying into climate change, because I feel like there's a lot of awareness here about that and does really closely affect biodiversity both ways. So.
I also think it'd be, I did a presentation on de-extinction in my biology class, kind of irrelevant, but it talked about how like a lot of conservation efforts are like a flagship species that like people, like it's a cute species that people really care about and like want to like maintain. And I think if we can find something that's native and cute in Los Angeles, that people would really start caring, and that would be great. Yeah, literally Los Angeles aesthetic. Yeah.
I know that turf and I guess fake grass, for lack of a better term, isn't good for the environment. That's for biodiversity. That's my understanding. But yeah, it's really bad. But from a, I guess, maybe this is more of a question for you, Katie, from a water conservation standpoint, what's more important?
Well, so, and you guys touched on this in your presentation, I think the thing that's important in all these is you have to balance it. So if you're going to look at it purely from water conservation, than an artificial turf would be. And for example, if it's a soccer field where kids are going to be using it to play, you probably want to keep in an artificial turf over something that's a native. But if you're thinking holistically throughout the city, which I think you guys all touched on the importance of thinking about it throughout, you would want to say we might not save quite as much water, but we're going to get all these additional benefits. And we're going to soak in more stormwater. We're not going to have runoff going into the ocean. Like, there's so much else that comes along that it's worth using the little bit more water to have a native or drought tolerant land covered than to go artificial.
So from like a city perspective, county perspective, you wouldn't want individual residents moving towards artificial turf.
If the choice, I mean, ideally, no, if the choice was a regular turf or artificial turf. That's tough because I have too strong of a personal opinion to know what the actual
well, I know it's a balance.
Well, there's actually a city in LA County, who shall remain nameless, that paid people to replace like turf with concrete because they incentivized it because it was purely informed by water conservation, and so it's one of the challenges when you only think about something from one silo of. But we in the City of LA and Metropolitan Water District have now, we rebate, you have to do watershed friendly. You have to replace it with things. And so it is a little more complicated, but we don't actually rebate artificial turf anymore. So it's definitely moving in that direction where we don't, you can still do it as a homeowner, but we're not going to incentivize you to do it. Yeah.
There is like that middle ground, right, with like between turf and grass of doing like a drought tolerant, like using like cacti and like desert plants and bark and stuff like that too, right?
Yeah, and some nice grasses if you still want the space to play with kids or do that.
How novel.
It's weird.
Place for
We had that here.
One other thing that came up when you were talking about endangered species, I thought that was interesting. Do you have other thoughts on when you were saying one of your recommendations for what could go in the Biodiversity Index? Endangered species is well, did you come across any in LA that you thought would be especially important to protect, and just how did you see that fitting into kind of a biodiversity strategy?
So I definitely think it would kind of be its own thing. Like fitting it into a biodiversity strategy would be good, but like I said, the management for endangered species is quite different from native, non-native, and things like that. So I just think special consideration should be taken for that when doing these biodiversity indices, maybe giving more priority to preserving some of the native endangered species and things like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because the legal framework is so different around the endangered species, and it brings in so many different departments, so it's an interesting space.
But even like the wildlife or the plants that support that invasive species or that endangered species, but not it specifically, thinking about framing things around those species.
It does make you wonder about the coordination between all the different entities that get involved in that. And I don't think there is short of, I really don't know, EPA maybe? I doubt it. I did a 6 months internship there and we didn't seem to get much done at all.
And it's hard.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Santa Monica's doing all these great things, and it's so hard to scale some of these things too. From when you get into these really broadly spread out areas, like it is wonderful to have an arborist that you can actually send to all the places in your area. And so that's one of the biggest challenges, thinking about how do you scale these things, and how do you go from what you can do really well in a smaller community where you have a really invested constituency too, like Santa Monica. They will do whatever is good for the environment. Like you can get a lot of stuff through City Council in Santa Monica that you could not get through most other places in the country. And so thinking about how you take some of these things that are working really well, and in an area as complex as LA, with as many agencies involved and as many legal different landscapes that are there. To your trees point, we were sued because of what trees are doing to sidewalks, and we're currently going through a sidewalk repair program because of trees. So how do we plant trees when we're doing this? Yeah,
we'll take trees as a Southwest.
So just to be thinking about as you go forward, because you all did a wonderful job really, taking on these broad topics and thinking about it and coming with recommendations. And kind of the next thing to think about is how would you go into this something like this with these great solutions that you found, and how would you implement them? Education came up as one example. You guys talked about that a lot, saying, hey, you might see a little bit more grass here, but it doesn't mean that it's messy. It means that we're letting butterflies be here, or we're So those kinds of things I think are really great, and you've all done background research to kind of get to those places and started touching on some of those recommendations that were really great.
Yeah, I think education, especially at the younger age level, is really important because that's going to be our future generation. And like, I know Carlos talked a lot about this in her class. If you educate the younger kids, they're going to go home and tell their parents. And that's a great way to reach them.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I know we've got some lunch over here for anyone who wants to partake. And I want to thank Katie and Jessica and Carla. Thank you for joining us today. What a treat. Please continue the conversation. I guess we have this room for a bit. So
Thanks, folks.
thank you all. Great job.